A 4,000-pound rhinoceros, standing completely still, pressing his forehead against the glass, and refusing to move. Not because he was scared. Not because he was angry, but because the one person he trusted in this entire world was standing on the other side of that wall, and he wasn't ready to say goodbye. This is the story of Atlas, and the man who raised him from a 3-week-old calf who could barely stand, to the most quietly powerful animal you have ever seen. It is also the story of a lawsuit, a judge who made a decision that nearly destroyed everything, a sanctuary that was nothing like it claimed to be, and a moment in a loading corridor that nobody in that zoo will ever forget for as long as they live. What happens when a courtroom decides it knows better than the man who has spent 15 years learning every sound, every habit, every breath of an animal that cannot speak for itself? What happens when the system meant to protect gets it completely wrong? And what does a rhinoceros do when the only way to tell you something matters is to press 4,000 pounds of absolute certainty against a pane of glass and wait? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everyone who saw it, and it started with a judge, a ruling, and a goodbye that almost became permanent. Nobody at the Riverside Zoo in Cincinnati, Ohio thought it would end like this. Nobody imagined that a judge in a quiet county courthouse would one day decide the fate of a 4,000-pound southern white rhino named Atlas. And nobody, absolutely nobody, expected what Atlas himself would do on the morning they finally came to take him away. Marcus Webb had worked at Riverside Zoo for 19 years.
Morning, David.
He was not the kind of man who cried in public. He had held injured animals through long cold nights. He had watched young zebras take their first steps on shaking legs. He had once stood in the rain for 6 straight hours just to make sure a sick giraffe kept eating. But nothing in those 19 years had prepared him for this moment. Atlas had arrived at the zoo as a calf. He was 3 weeks old, barely able to stand on his own. His mother had died during a difficult birth at a breeding facility in South Africa.
Come on, little guy.
And it was Marcus who had bottle-fed him for the first 4 months of his life. Every morning at 4:30.
All right, good boy.
Every single morning without exception. They shared a bond that most people who had never worked with large animals would find impossible to put into words. It was not soft. It was not sentimental in the way people imagine. It was something older and quieter than that. A kind of recognition. Atlas knew the sound of Marcus's footsteps before he could even catch his scent. And Marcus knew Atlas's breathing patterns well enough to sense when the animal was anxious before the rhino had even moved a single inch. That bond was about to be tested by a courtroom. The organization called itself Free Range Forward. They were an animal rights group based out of Portland, Oregon, and in the summer of 2021 they filed a 46-page federal lawsuit against the Riverside Zoo. The claim was straightforward, at least on paper. Atlas the rhinoceros, they argued, was being held in conditions that constituted psychological cruelty. They presented photographs of his enclosure. They brought in an expert who had spent time studying rhinos in the wild, and that expert testified that Atlas showed behavioral signs consistent with what researchers called zoochosis, repetitive pacing, occasional head swaying, a general withdrawal from stimulation. The zoo pushed back hard. Their veterinary team presented years of health records. Atlas was physically healthy. His diet was carefully managed. He had enrichment activities built into every single day of his week. And Marcus testified for nearly 3 hours about the daily routine he maintained with the animal. He described the morning feedings, the afternoon walks through the secondary enclosure, the way Atlas would tilt his enormous head to the side when Marcus scratched a specific spot just behind his ear. The courtroom listened, some people smiled, a few of the jurors leaned forward. But Free Range Forward had done their homework. They had a narrative. They had emotion. And in the court of public opinion, which was playing out in real time across social media, they were winning by a landslide. The case dragged on for 14 months. There were 3 different judges assigned to it before it landed in the courtroom of the Honorable Patricia Greer. Judge Greer had a reputation for pragmatism. She was known for clear thinking and little patience for theater, but she was also known for something else. She had grown up near a roadside zoo in rural Kentucky, and she had once spoken publicly about how those animals had looked, their eyes, the way they moved. She had used the word haunted. At the hearing, Free Range Forward presented a video, 12 minutes of footage filmed covertly through the public viewing area over a series of weeks. It showed Atlas standing near the same corner of his enclosure for long stretches in the afternoon. It showed him rocking slightly. It showed moments where he pressed his forehead against the reinforced glass of the public viewing barrier and stood there, motionless, for minutes at a time. The zoo's lawyers argued the footage was edited and misleading, that every clip had been cherry-picked from hundreds of hours of normal activity. Marcus himself asked to speak directly to the judge.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
He explained what the afternoon corner meant to Atlas. It was the warmest spot in the enclosure when the sun moved west. He explained that the rocking was something Atlas had done since he was a calf, a self-soothing habit the veterinary team had monitored and determined was non-distressing. He explained that the head-to-glass contact was a behavior Atlas showed only when he was curious about a visitor, or when he was looking for Marcus specifically.
Can you be more specific?
Judge Greer listened to all of it. She took notes. She asked 3 clarifying questions, and then she adjourned the hearing for 6 weeks while she reviewed the full record. The ruling came on a Tuesday morning in November. It was 41 pages long. Judge Greer had reviewed every piece of evidence, every expert testimony, every photograph and every health record, and she had written her conclusion with the careful language of someone who knew her decision would be scrutinized from every direction. She found in favor of Free Range Forward, not on the grounds of physical neglect. The zoo had no case to answer on that count. But on the narrower question of psychological enrichment and habitat adequacy for a large solitary mammal, she found the evidence tilted, just barely, toward the plaintiffs. Atlas was to be transferred to the Greenfield Animal Sanctuary in Central Florida, a facility that Free Range Forward had proposed and the court had approved. The zoo had 60 days to prepare the animal for transport and complete the handover. Marcus read the ruling at his kitchen table at 6 in the morning. He read it 3 times. He did not speak for a long time. His wife, Dana, sat across from him and put her hand on his arm. He said nothing. He just looked out the window toward the backyard where his kids were still asleep, and then he stood up, put on his jacket, and drove to the zoo to tell Atlas good morning the same way he had done it for 15 years, as if the ruling had not happened, as if nothing in the world had changed, because for the next 60 days, for Atlas, it hadn't. The night before the transfer, Marcus stayed at the zoo until nearly midnight. He had been given special permission by the director. He sat in the keeper's access corridor just outside Atlas's enclosure, on a folding metal chair, with a bag of the Rhino's favorite sliced melon resting on his lap. Atlas knew he was there. The animal came to the inner gate and stood, not moving, just standing. Marcus talked to him the way you talk to someone who understands your tone even if they can't follow your words. He told him about the time Atlas had gotten loose from the secondary enclosure when he was 2 years old and wandered into the reptile house. He told him about the night a bad storm had knocked out the heating and Marcus had slept in the barn until the backup system came online. He told him that wherever he was going, Marcus hoped the grass was longer and the mud was deeper and the mornings came warm. He slid a slice of melon through the gate. Atlas took it with his upper lip, the way he always did, unhurried and deliberate, and then he pressed the flat side of his great gray head against the gate and held it there. Marcus placed his open hand against the metal on his side. They stayed like that for a long time. The zoo was quiet. The other animals had settled. There was nothing but the low hum of the ventilation system and the sound of a man trying to say goodbye without using that word. The transport team arrived at 7 in the morning. 2 vans, a specialized livestock truck, and a veterinary crew from a facility in Tampa. They were efficient and professional. They had moved large animals dozens of times, they knew the procedure, and they had tranquilizers ready if needed. But Atlas did not cooperate with the loading. Not aggressively, not dangerously, but in the specific, quiet, immovable way that a 4,000-pound animal can simply refuse to move when it has decided not to. He kept returning to the public viewing glass. The thick reinforced barrier that ran the length of the front face of his main enclosure. He would walk to the loading corridor, pause, and then turn back. He did it 4 times in 40 minutes. The transport vet considered sedation. Marcus asked for 10 more minutes. He walked to the public side of the glass. He stood directly in front of Atlas on the other side of that thick transparent wall, and Atlas crossed the enclosure and pressed his forehead against the glass. He pushed into it with a slow and certain weight, and he held it there, looking at Marcus through 2.5 inches of reinforced transparency. The transport team watched from the corridor. The zoo director watched from the observation deck. Nobody spoke. After nearly 3 minutes, Marcus placed both hands flat on the glass. He gave a single nod. Atlas lifted his head, turned, and walked into the loading corridor and did not stop. He was loaded without sedation. The truck pulled out at 9:17 in the morning. Marcus stood in the empty enclosure for a long time after it was gone. 12 days after Atlas arrived at the Greenfield Animal Sanctuary, a former staff member contacted the Cincinnati Enquirer. Her name was Rachel Torres. She had worked at Greenfield for 8 months the previous year before resigning, and she had kept notes. What she described did not match the facility's public image. The sanctuary had been approved based on a site inspection conducted 18 months earlier, before construction on the primary habitat had stalled due to funding issues. Atlas had been placed in a temporary holding enclosure that was smaller than the one he had left. The dedicated veterinary team that Greenfield had advertised in court documents consisted of one part-time consultant who visited twice a week. The enrichment program that had been central to the sanctuary's pitch was largely on paper. There had been 2 other large mammals at Greenfield in the past 3 years, a hippopotamus and a buffalo. Both had developed significant health complications within 6 months of arrival. The buffalo had died. Free Range Forward issued a statement saying they were looking into the claims. The zoo's legal team filed an emergency motion for Atlas's return the same afternoon the story ran. Marcus said nothing publicly. He had been warned by the zoo's lawyers not to speak to the press, but that evening he drove home from work, sat in his driveway for 20 minutes, and then called his wife and said 4 words, "They have to fix this." The emergency motion was heard 8 days later. A different judge reviewed it. The evidence Rachel Torres had provided was damning and specific. Greenfield could not produce documentation for the veterinary claims. The construction delay on the primary habitat was confirmed by county permit records. Judge Greer, who was not assigned to the emergency motion but who submitted a written statement to the court, described her original ruling as made in good faith based on false information and said she supported an immediate return. Atlas was back at the Riverside Zoo 31 days after he had left. The transport truck pulled in through the rear service gate on a cold Thursday morning. Marcus was waiting in the enclosure. The loading ramp came down. There was a long pause, and then Atlas walked out slowly, deliberately, into the familiar space. He stopped in the middle of the enclosure and was still for a moment. Then he moved to the far corner, the warmest spot when the afternoon sun moved west, and stood there. Marcus walked over and stopped a few feet away. Atlas turned his head sideways and looked at him. Marcus reached out and scratched the spot just behind his ear. Atlas made a low sound, deep in his chest, that the keepers had never been able to name or classify, something between a grunt and a sigh, something that belonged only to him. The public viewing glass was fogged from the cold that morning, but if you had pressed your hand against it from the outside, and looked in, you would have seen exactly what you needed to see.